We know Oliver Hardy as one half of the legendary duo Laurel and Hardy, the man with the imposing figure, the awkward smile, and the comic mishaps that never failed to make the world laugh. Yet behind the stage lights and that iconic grin, Hardy quietly lived a complex double life for many years without anyone knowing. What the public saw was merely the tip of the iceberg, while the real secret behind the man himself remained a chapter of his life that has only now begun to be revealed. In the final days of the summer of 1957, in a quiet house in North Hollywood, Oliver Hardy, the man who had made millions of people around the world roar with laughter, lay motionless. After a series of devastating strokes, the body that had once been the perfect instrument for his masterful physical comedy had completely betrayed him. He could no longer speak, could no longer walk, and only his eyes remained, carrying a sense of resignation. The trademark looked directly into the camera that he had used for decades whenever his on-screen character Ollie found himself in disaster. Yet ironically, while the artist was slowly fading away in the obscurity of pain, Oliver Hardy's image was still smiling on television screens everywhere, still struggling with his tie, still trying to maintain his dignity amid the most absurd situations. Audiences had no idea that behind the round, clumsy, ever-optimistic Ollie was a man enduring the most painful physical collapse of his life. That pain was not Hardy's alone. Not far away, his lifelong partner and closest collaborator, Stan Laurel, was also heartbroken. Their bond ran so deep that when Hardy became critically ill, Laurel was utterly devastated. Doctors even advised him not to attend his friend's funeral, fearing that the aging heart of the thin one would not be able to withstand another emotional shock. Oliver Hardy's passing was not merely the death of an actor, it marked the end of an era of pure comedy. The world lost the smile of a giant, but few realized that behind the bumbling figure seen on screen, Hardy had lived a deeply reflective double life, always trying to straighten the tie of his own life, even when everything around him had completely fallen apart. To understand why Oliver Hardy carried himself with such dignified resignation, we must travel back to Georgia in the late 19th century. Hardy was not born into laughter. He grew up in the aftermath of the American Civil War, where ideals of honor and endurance among Southern men were deeply ingrained. Yet the world of young Oliver was soon overshadowed by the gray tones of loss. His father died before he was even 1 year old, leaving a permanent void in his memory. However, the deepest scar, the one that would later shape his sensitivity, came from the tragic death of his brother Sam. In a horrific river accident, Oliver witnessed his brother drown in his arms despite desperately trying to save him. This was not an ordinary accident, it was a psychological earthquake. Later, psychologists believed that the feeling of carrying an unusually heavy body, not because of physical weight, but because of the burden of helplessness in that moment, became a hidden emotional ingredient that Hardy brought into his performances. That is why, in every awkward step and every helpless glance from Ollie on screen, there remains a pain that is difficult to define. Hardy was not simply performing comedy. He was recreating the moment when he had struggled to keep everything normal amid the chaos of fate. That early loss and his lifelong effort to control the pain unintentionally gave birth to a unique acting style. A man constantly striving to remain polite and composed, even while life relentlessly pushed him into unavoidable disasters. Oliver Hardy never felt like a child who truly belonged in the world around him. With a larger physique than his peers, he was like a lonely giant in a crowd, always feeling that the strict discipline of school or the rigid structure of military life were garments far too tight for his spirit. Yet within that sense of isolation, he discovered a refuge and a passionate love, music. He became captivated by grand operas and fascinated by the way singers such as Enrico Caruso could move millions with their voices. In his youthful dreams, Oliver never imagined becoming a comic performer. He longed to be a stage singer, immersed in melodies that were both heroic and romantic. Fate, however, led him to the Palace Theatre, a dusty venue that would become the greatest university of his life. There, working as a cleaner, ticket seller, and projectionist was not merely a means of earning a living, it became an education in observation. Oliver spent thousands of hours standing quietly in the dark corners of the theatre, his wide eyes carefully studying every shadow that appeared on the screen. He was not simply watching films, he was dissecting laughter. Whenever the theatre emptied, when the last patrons had left and darkness enveloped the space, Oliver's experimental stage began. Standing alone beneath the dim stage lights among hundreds of empty seats, he embarked on a patient journey of self-education. He studied how silent film actors moved, how they used their hands to tell stories, and how their eyes conveyed panic or joy. He did not imitate mechanically. He searched for ways to breathe life into what he observed. He stood before mirrors, experimenting with hundreds of expressions, a doubtful frown, a polite and awkward smile, or a look of astonishment when confronted with imagined adversity. Oliver tirelessly refined himself, transforming what had once seemed a physical disadvantage into a valuable expressive tool. Those sleepless nights at the Palace Theatre taught him the most important lesson of all. Art does not lie in exaggerated gestures, but in a profound understanding of human emotion. It was in the solitude of that dark room, surrounded by aging reels of film, that the giant Oliver Hardy learned how to turn his loneliness into the language of laughter, quietly preparing himself for a life that would change the history of comedy forever. In 1913, Oliver Hardy decided to venture into the new frontier of Jacksonville, Florida, then regarded as the South's primitive filmmaking hub. If the Palace Theatre was where he nurtured his artistic dreams, Jacksonville became the true forge that tempered him. Cinema at that time bore none of the glamour associated with red carpets or award ceremonies. It was manual labor, a world where films were produced at a dizzying pace, demanding the endurance of a laborer rather than the elegance of an artist. The year 1915 became a grueling yet glorious milestone in his life. To survive and establish his name, Hardy threw himself relentlessly into the machine. There were days when he had to perform in 3 or 4 different film sets in rotation, rushing from one studio to another simply to keep up with production schedules. It was a crushing pressure cooker where creativity was forced to bloom amid constant haste. Yet it was precisely within this harsh industrialization that Hardy discovered his own rhythm. In a comedy market where performers often competed by exaggerating movements, falling harder or shouting louder, Hardy chose the opposite path. He gradually realized that true humor lay in restraint. He began shaping his style through carefully calculated pauses. These were moments when he stared directly into the camera with an irritated expression, a look of weary resignation as though he were enduring the mischievous jokes of fate itself. The nickname Babe was born during this period, as colleagues noticed the amusing contrast between his large physique and his gentle, refined nature. Hardy started perfecting the smallest details, the way he smoothed his tie before facing catastrophe, the way he adjusted his tight suit to preserve the last shred of dignity before everything collapsed. He was no longer a supporting actor performing simple gags. He had become Babe Hardy, a sophisticated gentleman perpetually powerless in a chaotic world. That slow, measured composure, standing in complete contrast to the disorder around him, transformed him into a unique cinematic presence and laid the foundation stones of the comedy monument the world was about to witness. In 1921, Oliver Hardy and Stan Laurel appeared together on screen for the first time in The Lucky Dog. At the time, however, there was not the slightest trace of chemistry between them. They were simply 2 actors trying to find their place, performing alongside one another while remaining separate individuals. No one, not even they themselves, could have imagined that this unremarkable meeting would become the beginning of a destiny already written. For the next 5 years, they continued as solitary artists within Hollywood's industrial machine, until 1926 became the turning point that permanently changed both their lives. On set, an unusual accident occurred. Oliver Hardy suffered severe burns from a piping hot leg of lamb platter. The painful incident forced him to leave work for a period of recovery. During Hardy's absence, Stan Laurel was brought in to complete the unfinished scenes. Then something extraordinary happened. When directors and producers reviewed the footage, they were astonished. They discovered a remarkable chemistry, an invisible bond that no one had previously recognized. Their contrast was not merely physical, one a large, imposing figure and the other a slender, fragile man, but also psychological. Laurel appeared as a lovable fool whose innocence constantly created trouble, while Hardy embodied a refined gentleman who was easily irritated, a man convinced he could control everything only to become the greatest victim of his own plans. This was no longer mere acting. It was the resonance of two perfect pieces fitting together. Audiences did not laugh at their helplessness. They laughed because they empathized with it. That accidental partnership, born from a burn injury, created an inseparable duo. From scattered pieces within the film factory, Laurel and Hardy merged into one, creating a new language of comedy, a comedy of helplessness infused with compassion, a legacy that would earn the world's admiration for decades to come. When the 1930s arrived, Laurel and Hardy were no longer simply comedians. They had become a global cultural institution. Everywhere, from elegant cinemas in London to small fairs in rural America, people instantly recognized the image of the large babe, squeezed into a tight suit, solemnly adjusting his tie with self-important dignity, standing beside a Stan Laurel forever fumbling with his head lowered in remorse. They became symbols of optimism during the years of the Great Depression, a remedy for a world exhausted by economic hardship. When cinema entered the sound era, it became a deadly hurdle for many silent film stars who were forced to abandon their fame because their voices did not match their screen personas. For Oliver Hardy, however, it marked a proud transformation. His slow, warm Southern voice, occasionally formal and commanding, not only enhanced the gentlemanly nature of Ollie, but also introduced an entirely new comedic rhythm. That voice brought his harmless complaints to life, making them more vivid and emotionally resonant than ever before. In 1932, the peak of their career was permanently etched into history with an Academy Award for the short film The Music Box. The film's iconic sequence, in which the pair exhaust themselves trying to push a piano up an endless staircase, became a profound metaphor for human existence. Audiences did not merely laugh, they felt sympathy. When they failed, when the piano rolled all the way back down the steps, viewers were not laughing at stupidity, but at humanity's desperate persistence in the face of absurd obstacles imposed by fate. That Oscar statuette was not merely recognition from the Academy. It was proof that physical comedy, often dismissed as a lesser art form, had reached the highest level of artistic achievement. It was the moment when the fat man Oliver Hardy stood atop the summit of success, enjoying the loudest applause of his life, unaware that Hollywood's gears would soon begin turning in a different direction, and that exhausting years within the industrial production system awaited him ahead. By the late 1940s, the brilliant glow of fame had begun to take on the colors of sunset. When the legendary duo left the protection of Hal Roach Studios, where they had enjoyed the freedom to create as genuine artists, and signed contracts with giant machines such as Fox and MGM, a harsh reality descended upon them. Hollywood no longer operated through spontaneous creativity and human warmth, but through rigid production charts and inflexible industrial procedures. Within the major studios, Laurel and Hardy were reduced to hourly employees. The natural creativity that had once been the soul of their comedy was stripped away by directors who failed to understand the unique chemistry between them. Their comic routines were now calculated, measured, and pre-arranged in scripts. Every valuable moment of improvisation was eliminated because it fell outside the production plan. They were no longer allowed to be artists. They became comedy workers, trapped inside the tight suits of their own making. Fatigue gradually seeped into every frame of film. The laughter was no longer effortless or genuine, and the atmosphere on set became heavy and calculated. This pain reached its peak with their final film, Atoll K, 1951. It was an agonizing experience that fans would later prefer not to revisit. By then, both men's health had deteriorated severely. Hardy was seriously ill, and the body that had once served as the perfect instrument for comedy had become frail and worn, while Laurel was in little better condition. On screen, the sight of two aging, exhausted men struggling to recreate the comic routines of their youth created a haunting sense of sadness. Audiences who had once adored them no longer saw the mischievous Ollie and Stan of earlier years. They saw two artists wrestling with time and the consequences of aging. The joy of comedy had been replaced by heartbreak, a bitter reminder of how Hollywood could crush even its greatest icons when art was sacrificed to the machinery of profit and soulless production systems. The public knew Oliver Hardy as the large, clumsy Ollie, forever stumbling into absurd situations and solemnly adjusting his tie as though trying to conceal his embarrassment. But that was only half the truth. Behind the mask of the comic character, the real Oliver Hardy was an entirely different man, calm, refined, and burdened with deeply personal emotions. His marital journey reflected the uneven terrain of his life. His first two marriages were turbulent, marked by arguments, the pressures of fame, and relentless media scrutiny that left him emotionally exhausted. Only when he found harmony and peace with his final wife, Virginia Lucille Jones, did Hardy truly regain a sense of stability. In their home, there was none of the noise of comedy routines, only the quiet presence of a gentleman who remained impeccably dressed and graceful in every gesture. There was also a fascinating contrast in his personality. In real life, Hardy was a genuine devotee of fine cuisine and the game of golf. On the golf course, he was no longer the bumbling Ollie. There he could shed the restrictive suit, escape the glare of the spotlight, and find tranquility among green fairways and open spaces. It became a refuge where he could escape Hollywood's relentless demands and simply be himself. Yet perhaps the most remarkable thing about this man was the astonishing gentleness of his heart. Behind the imposing figure often cast as a bully or troublemaker was an extraordinarily sensitive soul. One small but unforgettable story reveals this side of him. Hardy was once a hunter, but after witnessing an animal he had shot lying in pain and suffering, he was horrified and abandoned hunting forever. He could not bear the thought of causing pain to any living creature. This sensitivity is the key to understanding who he truly was. Hardy was never clumsy. He was simply a soul too gentle for a world that was often far too loud. He lived a perfect double life, one side bringing laughter to the world, the other quietly protecting his own heart from life's harshness through discretion and compassion. The final chapters of Oliver Hardy's life were not pages filled with glory, but rather a silent and tragic battle against fate. After a severe heart attack in 1954, the giant who had once embodied vitality and laughter began to fade away. His weight loss was sudden and devastating, leaving him gaunt and fragile. His trademark suit, once a protective armor that gave confidence to the character of Ollie, now hung loosely from his shrinking frame, a stark symbol of time's relentless destruction. Yet the greatest pain was not physical but silent. A succession of strokes attacked his brain and robbed him of language, taking away the voice that had once charmed the world with its warm southern tone. During his final months in North Hollywood, Oliver Hardy could neither speak nor express his thoughts. Yet in his eyes, people could still recognize that famous direct gaze into the camera, the look of a gentleman driven into a corner, yet still filled with patience and grace. On the 7th of August 1957, Oliver Hardy passed away at the age of 65, bringing to a close a life filled with both triumph and sorrow. His death left a permanent void in the heart of Stan Laurel. His lifelong friend and partner, the man who had shared every stage of the journey, from dusty film sets to Academy Award triumphs, was utterly devastated. The grief was so overwhelming that doctors advised Laurel not to attend the funeral, fearing that the aging heart of the thin man might fail beside the coffin of his closest companion. Oliver Hardy did not become a legend because of power or perfection. He became immortal because he taught humanity how to forgive its own helplessness. His legacy is not confined to old films. It lives on in a deeply human message. Even when the world collapses around us, even when adversity corners us, preserving that final measure of dignity, straightening a tie, standing tall, and facing hardship with a resigned smile is how we protect our humanity. That is the enduring legacy of a fat man who devoted his life to showing the world that even when we are awkward and unsuccessful, we still deserve love and the right to smile. The laughter Hardy gave to the world is eternal, but the life he lived behind the screen was a profoundly reflective epic. If this story has brought you closer to the legendary Fat Man, please leave a like and share this video with fellow lovers of classic cinema. Until next time, see you in the stories behind the films.